The message arrived while I was standing in the grocery store. "We'll use your apartment this weekend," my daughter wrote. "My in-laws are coming." Then another message appeared before I could respond. "You can stay somewhere else for 2 nights." I stared at the screen longer than I should have, not because of the request, but because it was not a request at all. It was a decision already made, as if my home had quietly stopped belonging to me. What she did not know was simple. The spare key she still carried no longer opened my door. And that weekend, standing outside that locked apartment, a story she had told everyone for years was about to collapse. Before we dive into today's story, take a moment to share where you're watching from. We love seeing how our stories bring people together from every corner of the world. Your thoughts and comments are what make this community so special, and we're truly grateful to have you here. If you haven't already, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story filled with drama, resilience, and unexpected twists. Now, settle in, get comfortable, and maybe grab your favorite drink, because this is a tale you won't want to miss. Let's get started. My name is Eleanor Hayes, and I am 63 years old. I live alone in a small apartment overlooking the harbor in Charleston, South Carolina. If you stand on my balcony early enough in the morning, before the tourist boats begin moving and before the traffic grows loud, you can watch the fishing boats leave the marina one by one. The water looks almost silver at that hour, and the gulls circle lazily above it as if the whole city is still half asleep. Those quiet mornings have become my favorite part of the day. After a lifetime of noise, responsibilities, and people needing something from me, I have learned to appreciate silence more than anything else. 8 years ago, my husband passed away after a long illness. For nearly 3 decades before that, we had lived in a large house on the outskirts of Charleston. It was the kind of house you buy when you are raising a family and planning a future. It had a wide porch, a backyard with 2 oak trees, and more rooms than the 2 of us really needed once our daughter grew up. After he was gone, the house felt too large and too full of memories. Every hallway seemed to echo with things that were no longer there. So I sold it. The decision surprised a lot of people, but to me it felt practical. I bought this apartment near the historic Harbor District with the savings my husband and I had built over the years. It was not enormous, but it was bright and comfortable, with tall windows and a narrow balcony that faced the water. I filled the living room with my books, arranged the furniture slowly, and little by little, the place began to feel like a new chapter rather than the end of an old one. Before retiring, I worked for many years as a library manager for the Charleston Public Library System. It was steady work that required patience and organization, 2 qualities that come naturally to me. When I finally retired, my days settled into a rhythm that suited me well. I walked along the harbor most mornings, stopped by a cafe on King Street for coffee, and spent afternoons reading or meeting an old colleague for lunch. It was a quiet life, but after everything that had happened, quiet felt like a gift. My daughter Vanessa lives several hours away in Charlotte, North Carolina. She is 34 now and works as a real estate agent. Vanessa has always been ambitious, the kind of person who walks into a room already thinking about how she will stand out from everyone else. She married a man named Mark Caldwell a few years ago. Mark comes from a family that runs a successful construction business, and his parents care very much about reputation and social standing. Over time, I noticed that when Vanessa talked about Charleston to her husband's family, she often mentioned my apartment. She described it as if it were a kind of family place, somewhere convenient and elegant where they could stay when visiting the city. At first, I assumed she was simply speaking casually. Children sometimes exaggerate their parents' lives without meaning any harm. But little remarks began to add up. Vanessa would say things like how useful the apartment was for weekend visits, or how perfectly located it was near the harbor restaurants. The way she spoke about it suggested something slightly different from reality, as if the apartment belonged to a wider circle than just me. I did not challenge those comments when I first heard them. Perhaps I should have. Looking back now, I realize I ignored those small signs because I believed the boundaries were obvious. I assumed my daughter understood the difference between describing something and claiming it. At the time, none of it seemed important enough to question. I had no idea that those small assumptions would soon lead to a moment when the quiet life I had carefully built would be tested in a way I had never expected. If you are still watching, and this story is already raising questions in your mind, comment number 1 below so I know you are here with me, because what seemed like a peaceful life was about to reveal the first warning sign. Now let us move on to chapter 2, where something unexpected happened inside that apartment. One afternoon, about a month before everything happened, I returned from the farmer's market near the Charleston harbor with a paper bag full of peaches and a loaf of bread. It was one of those slow coastal afternoons when the air smelled faintly of salt and warm pavement. Tourists moved lazily along the sidewalks, and a light breeze drifted in from the water. I remember feeling content as I walked back toward my building, thinking about nothing more complicated than what I might cook for dinner. My apartment building sits on a quiet street not far from the historic harbor district. It is not extravagant, but it is well kept, and most of the residents have lived there for years. The hallway outside my door usually smells faintly of cleaning solution and polished wood. That day seemed no different when I unlocked the door and stepped inside. At first, I thought I had walked into the wrong apartment. 2 strangers were standing in my living room. A man and a woman stood near the windows, both holding their phones as if they had been taking photographs. For a second, none of us moved. The woman lowered her phone slowly, and the man looked from me to the doorway as if he had suddenly realized something had gone terribly wrong. I set the bag of groceries on the kitchen counter without saying anything. My voice came out calm, though my mind was still trying to catch up with what I was seeing. "What are you doing in my apartment?" The woman immediately apologized. She explained that they believed they had permission to be there. According to her, my daughter Vanessa had given them access to look at the apartment because it might be available for short-term rental in the future. The explanation was offered carefully, the way people speak when they are suddenly unsure whether they have made a serious mistake. I stared at her for a moment, trying to understand what she had just said. I had never told Vanessa she could offer my apartment to anyone. I had never discussed renting it at all. The man added that Vanessa had provided a key and assured them it would not be a problem. Hearing that detail made everything clearer in an instant. Vanessa still had the spare key I had given her years earlier when she lived closer to Charleston. Neither of the visitors stayed long once they realized I was the owner. They apologized again and gathered their things quickly. Within a minute, they were gone, the door closing behind them with a soft click that echoed through the quiet apartment. I stood in the living room for several minutes after they left. Nothing had been taken, and nothing was damaged. The furniture was exactly where it had always been, and the late afternoon sunlight still stretched across the wooden floor the same way it always did. Yet something about the room felt different now. For the first time since moving there, I understood how easily someone could enter my home without my knowledge. The spare key. That small piece of metal had once seemed like a practical precaution. I had given it to Vanessa years earlier when she occasionally visited Charleston for work. At the time, it felt like a simple gesture of trust between mother and daughter. Now, I wondered how many times that key had been used when I was not there. The next morning, I called a locksmith. He arrived with a small case of tools and suggested installing a modern electronic deadbolt lock along with a doorbell camera. The system would connect directly to my phone so I could see who was outside the door at any time. I agreed immediately. By the time he finished, the door looked exactly the same from the outside. The old key could still turn the lower handle, but without unlocking the new deadbolt, the door would never open. I considered calling Vanessa to explain the change. In the end, I decided not to. She would probably say I was overreacting, and perhaps she would even believe it. So I said nothing. I simply closed the door, tested the new lock once more, and told myself it was only a small precaution. At the time, I had no idea how important that quiet decision would soon become. If you are still watching and that moment made you uneasy, comment number 2 below to let me know you are still with me. Because the spare key was only the beginning, and the next message would change everything. Now let us continue to chapter 3, where one text message started the entire chain of events. A few weeks after I had the new lock installed, I found myself standing in the produce aisle of a grocery store near downtown Charleston on a quiet Thursday afternoon. The store was neither crowded nor empty. A few shoppers moved slowly through the aisles, pushing carts filled with the ordinary things people buy when they are planning simple meals for the week. Soft music drifted from the ceiling speakers, blending with the dull hum of refrigerators and the occasional squeak of a cartwheel. I was looking at a display of apples, trying to decide between 2 varieties, when my phone vibrated in my coat pocket. At first, I ignored it. Messages can wait when you are comparing fruit that all looks almost exactly the same. But the phone buzzed again, and something about the timing made me reach for it. The message was from my daughter, Vanessa. I opened it without thinking much about it. The words appeared on the screen in the same casual tone she always used. "We will use your apartment this weekend. Mark's parents are coming to Charleston." For a moment, I thought I might have misunderstood the sentence. I read it again slowly. The wording did not contain a question. It did not ask whether the apartment was available or whether I had plans. It simply announced what was going to happen. Before I could respond, another message appeared beneath the first. "You can stay somewhere else for 2 nights." A moment later, a link followed. When I tapped it, the screen opened to a listing for a modest hotel near Charleston International Airport. The photos showed a plain building with beige walls and a parking lot filled with identical cars. It was not the sort of place anyone would choose for a weekend unless they had no other option. I stood there, holding my phone while the grocery store continued around me exactly as it had before. Someone pushed a cart past my shoulder. A child laughed somewhere near the bakery section. The world moved normally, but the message in my hand felt strangely out of place. I read the text again, this time paying attention to what was not there. There was no greeting, no explanation beyond the short statement about Mark's parents visiting the city. Most importantly, there was no request for permission. The entire plan had already been decided. I typed a short reply and looked at it for a moment before sending it. "I will not be home this weekend." It seemed like the simplest possible answer. I did not explain where I would be or what my plans were. I only wanted to make one thing clear. Vanessa responded almost immediately. "Perfect. I still have your spare key." I stared at the screen for a few seconds after reading that line. Around me, the store continued its slow afternoon rhythm. A worker stacked oranges into a careful pyramid while an elderly couple debated the price of tomatoes nearby. Vanessa clearly believed she had solved the problem. From her perspective, the situation must have looked simple. Her mother was not going to be home, and she still had the key. The weekend would proceed exactly as she had promised everyone. What she did not know was that the key in her possession no longer opened the door the way it once had. The memory of the locksmith returned to me then, along with the quiet click of the new deadbolt locking into place. The spare key Vanessa carried could still turn the lower handle, but without unlocking the deadbolt above it, the door would remain firmly closed. For a brief moment, I considered sending another message explaining the change. It would have been easy enough to type a few extra words and prevent confusion later, but I did not. Instead, I slipped my phone back into my pocket and continued down the aisle with my cart. I selected the apples I had been considering earlier and placed them gently into a paper bag. As I moved through the rest of the store, I could not stop thinking about the tone of Vanessa's message. It had not sounded like a daughter asking a favor. It had sounded like someone making arrangements with a property she believed was already hers to use. By the time I reached the checkout counter, I realized something quietly important. For the first time in a very long while, I was not planning to fix the situation for her. If you are still here and starting to feel how wrong that message sounded, comment number 3 below, so I know you are paying attention, because the story behind that message runs deeper than it first appeared. Now let us move forward to chapter 4, where the real plan slowly begins to surface. When I left the grocery store that afternoon, the sky over Charleston had begun to soften into the pale gold color that comes just before sunset. The parking lot was quiet, with only a few cars scattered between the rows. I placed my bags in the back seat and sat behind the wheel for a moment longer than necessary, my hands resting lightly on the steering wheel while my thoughts circled back to the messages Vanessa had sent. At first, I had only felt surprised, but as I replayed the wording of those texts in my mind, a different realization slowly settled in. Vanessa had not asked whether she could use my apartment. She had already promised it to someone else. The more I thought about it, the more certain I became that the weekend plan had been decided long before she sent those messages to me. My daughter had likely told Mark and his parents that the arrangements were already handled. In her version of the story, the apartment in Charleston was simply waiting for them. I started the car and pulled out of the parking lot, but my thoughts had already drifted several months into the past. I remembered a dinner at Mark's parents' home not long after Vanessa married into their family. It had been a polite evening, full of careful conversation and the kind of small talk people use when they are still learning about one another. Mark's parents lived in a large house outside Charlotte, and the dining room had been arranged with quiet formality. At one point during the meal, Vanessa mentioned Charleston. She spoke warmly about the harbor, the restaurants along King Street, and the historic district that drew visitors every year. Then she casually added that her mother had a beautiful apartment there, right near the water. Mark's mother seemed interested immediately. She asked whether it was close to the downtown area and whether it was convenient for visitors. Vanessa smiled and nodded. She explained that the apartment was perfectly located and that it made weekend trips to Charleston very easy. The way she spoke about it suggested something more than simple ownership. She described it almost like a family retreat, a place that could be used whenever someone wanted to enjoy the city for a few days. I remember sitting quietly at the table while she spoke. At the time, I told myself it was just an exaggeration. Children often describe their parents' homes in flattering ways when speaking to others. I assumed Vanessa was simply trying to make conversation pleasant for her new family. But looking back, I realized that something had slowly changed over time. At first, she described the apartment as my home. Later, she began to speak of it as something shared. That difference might seem small to someone listening casually, but the meaning behind it was much larger. I also remembered hearing later about a conversation Vanessa had with Mark one evening after that dinner. He had apparently asked her whether she had checked with me before telling his parents they could stay there when visiting Charleston. Vanessa had brushed off the concern. She told him that I would not mind and that I would never embarrass her in front of her in-laws. When I learned about that comment much later, it stayed with me longer than I expected. Vanessa believed that no matter what arrangement she made, I would quietly step in and make sure it worked. She believed that maintaining peace in front of other people mattered more to me than correcting her. As I drove home from the store that afternoon, I began to understand something I had not fully admitted before. Vanessa had built an entire plan around that assumption. Mark's parents were coming to Charleston that weekend. Vanessa had promised them a comfortable place to stay near the harbor. In her mind, the details were already settled. The only part of the plan she had not confirmed was whether the door to my apartment would actually open. If you are still watching and beginning to understand what was really happening behind the scenes, comment number 4 below to let me know you are still here. Because the weekend was about to arrive, and the moment everyone expected the door to open was closer than they realized. Now, let us continue into the next part of the story. Saturday arrived quietly, the way most weekends in Charleston tend to begin. The morning air carried that familiar coastal warmth, and the streets near the harbor filled slowly with people enjoying the slower pace of a day without work. By late morning, I had met a longtime friend for lunch at a small cafe not far from King Street. It was the kind of place where conversations drift easily and no one feels rushed to leave. For a while, we talked about ordinary things: retirement, mutual friends, the small changes that happen in a city when you have lived in it long enough to notice them. I had almost forgotten about the messages Vanessa had sent earlier in the week. They lingered somewhere in the back of my mind, but the quiet comfort of lunch pushed them aside. Then my phone vibrated on the table. The screen lit up with a notification from the door camera application. It was the same system the locksmith had installed a few weeks earlier. Motion detected at front door. At first, I assumed it was a delivery driver or a neighbor passing through the hallway. Still, I opened the application without much thought. The camera feed appeared instantly on the screen. The hallway outside my apartment came into view. Vanessa was standing directly in front of the door. For a moment, I simply stared at the image, adjusting to the sudden shift from a quiet lunch to the scene unfolding on my phone. Behind Vanessa stood Mark. A few steps farther down the hallway were his parents, along with 2 men I did not recognize, but guessed were business associates of his. Several large suitcases rested beside the wall. The sight of those suitcases told me everything I needed to know. They were not stopping by for a short visit. They expected to stay. Across the table, my friend noticed my attention had shifted to the phone. She asked if everything was all right. I told her only that my daughter had arrived at my apartment unexpectedly. It was easier than explaining the entire situation in that moment. On the screen, Vanessa reached into her purse and pulled out a key. I recognized it immediately. It was the spare key I had given her years ago. Mark glanced down the hallway briefly, the way people do when they are aware they might be in the wrong place. Vanessa, however, looked confident. She stepped closer to the door and inserted the key into the lower lock. Even through the small speaker of the camera microphone, I could hear the faint click as the key turned. The handle moved, but the door did not open. Vanessa paused, clearly surprised. She tried again, turning the key a second time and pushing against the door with a little more force. The result was exactly the same. The knob rotated smoothly, yet the door remained firmly shut. From the angle of the camera, I could see Mark lean slightly closer to the frame, examining the lock as if trying to understand what had gone wrong. Vanessa stepped back and frowned at the door. She inserted the key once more and twisted it harder than before. The handle turned easily, exactly the way it was designed to, but the deadbolt above it remained locked, holding the door in place. I watched the entire scene from my seat in the cafe, my phone resting quietly in front of me on the table. For several seconds, no one in the hallway moved. Vanessa stared at the door as though expecting it to change its mind. Behind her, the suitcases sat waiting against the wall. And slowly, almost visibly, confusion began to spread across the group standing outside my apartment. For several seconds after the door refused to open, the hallway outside my apartment remained strangely still. Vanessa stood close to the frame with the key still in her hand, staring at the handle as if it had betrayed her. The group behind her waited quietly, their suitcases lined neatly against the wall. The camera captured the scene with a steady, silent clarity that made every small movement feel significant. I sat at the cafe table watching it all unfold on my phone. Vanessa tried the key again. She inserted it carefully this time, turning it with a slow, deliberate motion, as though patience might somehow persuade the lock to cooperate. The knob rotated exactly as it always had, but the door remained shut. She pushed against it lightly, then harder. Nothing changed. Mark stepped closer, his attention fixed on the door. Even from the camera's angle, I could see the uncertainty forming on his face. He leaned forward slightly, examining the handle as if searching for a mechanical explanation. The knob turned freely. That detail seemed to matter to him. Vanessa tried once more, twisting the key sharply and pulling the handle toward her with visible frustration. When the door still did not move, she stepped back with a short breath that carried through the microphone beside the camera. Mark said something quietly. His expression suggested a question more than a statement. Vanessa responded with a brief shake of her head, brushing the concern aside. Her posture suggested confidence, but the movement felt forced. Behind them, Mark's parents exchanged a quick glance. They had been standing patiently near the suitcases, observing the scene the way polite people do when they are unsure whether they should intervene. One of the men, who appeared to be a business associate, shifted his weight from one foot to the other, clearly uncomfortable with the delay. Vanessa turned back to the door. She pressed her shoulder against it and pushed. The frame did not move. The lock above the handle remained firmly set in place, holding the door closed with quiet certainty. Another minute passed. Mark leaned closer again and touched the handle briefly, testing it himself. The knob turned smoothly in his hand before returning to its original position. He stepped back slowly, the way someone does when they have just confirmed a suspicion. Vanessa spoke again, though the tone carried a trace of tension now. She gestured toward the lock as if explaining that something must be wrong with it. The explanation seemed less convincing with each passing second. The hallway itself added to the discomfort. It was narrow and quiet, lined with identical doors that hid the private lives of other residents. A faint hum from the building ventilation system echoed softly above them. 10 minutes had passed since Vanessa first inserted the key. From my seat in the cafe, I watched the scene unfold without moving. My coffee had grown cold on the table beside me, but I had barely noticed. Vanessa tried the door again. This time she pushed harder, her frustration visible in the quick movement of her shoulders. When the door refused to open yet again, she stepped back and struck it once with the side of her foot. The sound echoed through the hallway. No one spoke for a moment after that. The silence that followed was heavier than the noise. It was in that quiet moment that something became clear to me. If I opened the door now, if I unlocked the deadbolt from my phone and allowed them inside, the entire situation would disappear as if nothing had happened. Vanessa would continue believing she could promise my apartment to anyone she wished. I looked at the screen in front of me and understood that the situation had reached a point where silence mattered. So I did nothing. And in the hallway outside my apartment, the realization slowly began to reach the people standing there. If you are still watching and wondering what happens when the truth can no longer be hidden, comment number 6 below so I know you made it this far, because the next part of the story changes everything. Now, let us move on to Chapter 7. After Vanessa kicked the door, the hallway grew quiet in a way that made the moment feel heavier than it had before. No one spoke right away. The sound of that single strike against the wood seemed to linger in the corridor long after it happened. The camera above my door captured the stillness clearly. Vanessa stood a step back from the frame now, her arms folded tightly as if the door itself had offended her. Behind her, Mark looked down the hallway for a moment, then back at the door. His parents remained beside the luggage they had brought, standing politely, but with the unmistakable discomfort of people who had begun to realize something was not going according to plan. Several minutes passed like that. From the cafe where I sat, I could see every detail on the small screen in front of me. The hallway light reflected faintly on the polished floor. The suitcases remained lined up against the wall as if they were waiting patiently for a door that refused to open. Mark finally shifted his weight and said something to Vanessa. His posture suggested the obvious solution, the one anyone would eventually suggest after standing outside a locked door for long enough. "Call your mother," Vanessa answered quickly, shaking her head. Her hand moved in a short, dismissive gesture toward the door, as though the lock itself were the problem. She insisted that I was not home and that the door must simply be malfunctioning. The explanation hung in the air for a moment, but the hallway itself did not seem to agree with her. At one point, a nearby door opened slightly. A neighbor looked out, clearly curious about the group standing in the corridor with their luggage. The glance lasted only a few seconds before the door quietly closed again. But the interruption added another layer of discomfort to the situation. Mark stepped closer to the door again and turned the handle himself. The knob rotated smoothly, just as it had every time Vanessa tried it. He released it slowly and stepped back. The silence returned. Standing in the cafe, I realized that the situation had reached a point where it would not remain private much longer. Vanessa had built a story around my apartment, and that story was now unraveling in front of the people she most wanted to impress. Then my phone buzzed again. This time, the notification did not come from the camera application. It came from the family group message thread. Vanessa had written a short line explaining that her mother had left them outside the apartment with their luggage. The message appeared in the conversation, where several relatives could read it at once. Almost immediately, replies began appearing beneath it. Questions mostly. Confusion from people trying to understand why a family visit had suddenly turned into a problem. I looked back at the camera feed again before responding. Vanessa was pacing now, her phone in her hand. Mark stood near the suitcases, speaking quietly with his parents. The entire scene was unfolding exactly the way she had hoped to avoid. For years, I had quietly corrected situations like this in private. I had stepped in, smoothed over misunderstandings, and allowed Vanessa to maintain whatever version of events she preferred other people to see. But this time felt different. I opened the camera archive and selected 2 still images from the recording. One showed Vanessa arguing in the hallway. The second captured the moment her foot struck the door. I attached both images to the family conversation. Then I typed a single sentence beneath them: "Please leave my home." For several seconds, the message thread stopped moving. And in the hallway outside my apartment, the silence grew even deeper than before. After I sent the images and the message telling Vanessa to leave my home, the family conversation thread became unusually quiet. For several seconds, nothing new appeared on the screen. The small notification icons that normally flickered with quick responses remained still. I imagined relatives staring at their phones, trying to understand what they were seeing. From the cafe table where I sat, I switched back to the camera feed. Vanessa was standing a few feet away from my door now, her phone raised slightly in front of her. The change in her posture was obvious. A few minutes earlier, she had looked irritated and impatient. Now she looked unsettled, the way someone does when a situation suddenly becomes larger than expected. Mark stood near the row of suitcases, watching her read whatever had appeared in the conversation thread. His parents had stepped farther down the hallway, speaking quietly with each other. The 2 men who had arrived with them remained near the wall, their expressions polite but uncertain. Vanessa looked up from her phone and turned toward Mark. Although the camera microphone did not capture every word clearly, her tone carried a sharp edge. She seemed upset that the images had been shared. Her movements were restless now, pacing a few steps down the hallway before returning toward the door again. Mark took the phone from her briefly and read the screen himself. His shoulders lowered slightly as he did, as though he had just confirmed something he already suspected. The hallway had become uncomfortable territory. What had started as a confident arrival with the luggage now looked more like a group stranded in front of a door that refused to recognize them. While watching the scene, I opened the email application on my phone. A thought had begun to form while the messages appeared in the family conversation. The situation in the hallway was no longer just a misunderstanding between a mother and her daughter. It had become a disturbance in the building where I lived. I wrote a short email addressed to the property management office. The words were simple but precise. I explained that I was currently away from my apartment and that a group of individuals was attempting to enter my unit without authorization. I included the apartment number and attached 2 still images taken from the camera feed. The language I chose was deliberate: unauthorized access, attempted entry, disturbance in the hallway. Those phrases were the kind property managers understood immediately. After reading the message once more, I pressed send. A quiet sense of certainty settled over me as I returned to the camera view. Vanessa was still standing near the door, but the tension in the hallway had changed. No one was trying the handle anymore. The earlier determination had faded into uneasy waiting. Mark was speaking quietly with his parents now. One of the men who had arrived with them checked his watch and glanced toward the elevator at the end of the corridor. The entire group seemed to understand that the situation had reached a point where patience alone would not solve it. I knew the building management office would respond quickly. They took security seriously, especially when a resident reported someone trying to enter a locked apartment. Watching the screen in my hand, I realized something that would have seemed impossible to me not long ago. The moment had passed when this could quietly disappear. Very soon, someone from the building would arrive in that hallway. And when they did, the story Vanessa had told everyone would finally meet the truth, standing outside my door. If you are still here and curious about how this situation will finally end, comment number 8 below, so I know you are ready for the conclusion, because what happens next will settle the story once and for all. Now, let us move into the final chapters and the ending of the story. About 15 minutes after I sent the email to the building management office, movement appeared again on the camera feed. 2 figures entered the hallway from the direction of the elevators. I recognized one of them almost immediately. He was the evening supervisor who often handled maintenance requests in the building. The second man wore a security badge clipped neatly to his jacket. They walked calmly toward the group gathered outside my apartment. Even through the small camera lens, I could see the shift in the hallway as Vanessa and the others noticed them approaching. Conversation stopped. Mark turned slightly, stepping away from the suitcases as the 2 employees reached the door. The supervisor looked first at the door itself, then at the people standing around it. His manner was controlled and professional, the tone someone uses when addressing a situation that must be handled carefully but clearly. He explained that the management office had received a message from the resident of the apartment. The resident had confirmed that no one had permission to enter the unit. Vanessa straightened quickly. She spoke with a mixture of frustration and urgency, explaining that the apartment belonged to her mother. Her gesture toward the door suggested that the explanation should have solved everything. The supervisor listened patiently. Then he repeated the important detail. The owner of the apartment had clearly stated that no one was authorized to enter while she was away. Because of that, the building could not allow anyone to attempt access to the unit. The hallway became even quieter after that. Mark stood beside the luggage cart, his expression tightening slightly as the situation settled into place. The 2 men who had come with them looked increasingly uncomfortable, their earlier patience now replaced with the awkward awareness that they had arrived somewhere they were not expected. Mark's father rubbed the back of his neck and glanced down the corridor. His reaction carried the weary frustration of someone realizing a plan had failed long before anyone admitted it. The security guard then spoke, politely but firmly. The group would need to clear the hallway. They could not remain outside the apartment or continue trying to open the door. For a moment, no one moved. Then Mark stepped forward and lifted one of the suitcases onto the luggage cart. The quiet decision seemed to settle the matter. He began arranging the other bags without argument. His parents followed his lead, gathering the remaining luggage. Vanessa lingered for a moment longer near the door, her eyes moving briefly toward the camera mounted above it. Whatever she felt in that moment stayed hidden behind the stillness of her face. Finally, she turned away. One by one, they moved toward the elevators, the cart rolling slowly along the polished floor. Within seconds, the hallway began to empty, and outside my apartment door, the quiet returned. Later that evening, I returned to the building. The hallway outside my apartment looked exactly the way it always did. The polished floor reflected the overhead lights, and the quiet hum of the ventilation system filled the space. There were no suitcases against the wall now, no voices, no sign that several people had stood there earlier, expecting the door to open. For a moment, I simply stood there. Then I unlocked the deadbolt from my phone and pushed the door open. The apartment greeted me with the same calm silence I had grown used to over the years. The living room was exactly as I had left it that morning. Light from the harbor filtered softly through the windows, reflecting across the wooden floor. I set my bag down on the table and stood there for a while without moving. What I felt was not triumph. It was something quieter than that. A sense that something long overdue had finally happened. After a few minutes, I opened the lock application on my phone. I updated the settings carefully, removing every access code that had ever been connected to the door. The old spare key Vanessa carried would never open this apartment again. When I finished, I called the building office and confirmed that no one should be allowed entry to my unit unless I approved it personally. Not long after that, my phone began to ring. Vanessa's name appeared on the screen more than once. I watched the calls come in but did not answer them. The silence felt necessary. Later, sitting on my balcony overlooking the dark harbor water, I understood something that had taken years to admit. The hardest part had never been installing the lock. It had been accepting that sometimes protecting your home also means protecting your boundaries. When a door closes, it is rarely just wood meeting a lock. Sometimes it marks the moment a person finally understands the quiet value of boundaries. Respect is not built through silence or sacrifice alone. It grows where honesty and self-worth are allowed to stand. Many people spend years trying to keep peace by giving a little more of themselves each time, believing that kindness means never saying no. Yet real strength often appears in the calm decision to protect what truly belongs to us: our space, our dignity, and the life we have worked to build. Moments like this remind us that love and respect are not the same as permission. A peaceful life is not something that simply happens. It is something we choose to defend. Thank you for spending your time with this story. If it made you reflect on your own experiences, feel free to share your thoughts in the comments. Your perspective matters, and if you enjoy thoughtful stories like this, consider following and subscribing so you do not miss the next one.